Just to start off, give a little background about NRCM. We're one of the Maine's oldest and largest environmental groups, and my program, our work covers forests and wildlife and healthy waters and sustainability. My program focuses on climate and clean energy, and in addition to offshore wind, we also cover a lot of the other big drivers of carbon emissions in Maine, including the transportation system, how we heat our buildings and things like that. So, but I'm going to talk about one particular solution to climate change, which is transitioning towards clean energy, and in particular offshore wind. So I'm going to start by putting offshore wind in the context of what Maine is doing already at the policy level on climate change. And there's a lot. We've been very active as a state in the policy realm over the past 5 or so years. But that big picture is that since 2019, we have set ambitious greenhouse gas reduction and clean energy goals. And you can see some of them on here. Clean energy goals of 80% by 2030, 100% by 2040, strong greenhouse gas reduction goals. And one of the most important pieces of this was forming the Maine Climate Council, which was a group of experts from all kinds of different fields that came together, deliberated, and sort of came up with a plan for the state that's really comprehensive. It actually won a national award for planning because of that comprehensiveness and the deliberation that went into it. And it's a sweeping plan, so I won't go into all of the 8 strategies and sub-strategies and action items and all of those things, but I raise it here to talk about one of the sort of core strategy that it embodies. And this all lays the foundation for why offshore wind is so critical, because the strategy that goes throughout the climate action plan is electrification. And that means switching towards electricity for how we heat our homes and businesses, away from fossil fuels, things like methane gas, propane, heating oil, how we fuel our cars and trucks, so switching towards electric vehicles and other zero emission vehicles, and importantly, powering all of that from clean energy. And this has a lot of benefits beyond just the climate benefits. There's less air pollution, which is really harmful to health, especially for people with pre-existing health conditions, older people, children. It means less exposure to price volatility. Almost all of the energy cost rises that we saw in the past couple of years came from the volatile prices of fossil fuels, whether that was at the gas pump for transportation, whether that was heating oil, whether that was electricity driven by natural gas generation prices in the New England market. But all of this needs to be powered by renewable energy as we get on all of this new electric load. And that is where so offshore wind is a huge opportunity for Maine. The Gulf of Maine has some of the strongest and most consistent wind speeds in the world. And that means that every turbine that we end up putting in the water in the Gulf of Maine is going to be giving us more bang for our buck. It's going to be generating more energy more of the time. Offshore wind provides a great complement to solar energy because they peak at different times. Solar energy generates the most during the day, obviously, and during the summer. And offshore wind and onshore wind generate more at night and in the winter. So with those powers combined, that means that we reduce the overall system needs that we need to move around and store this renewable energy. There are huge economic development and jobs benefits that could come with this new industry. If we develop a commercial offshore wind industry in the Gulf of Maine, we could be leading the way on floating offshore wind. The Gulf of Maine is too deep for fixed bottom offshore wind. That's what they're building in southern New England and elsewhere. That's basically, as Senator King puts it, it's basically onshore wind, but in the water. So it's just built on a pile and a piling in shallow water. Floating offshore wind is different. It's going to be on big floating platforms anchored far out in the ocean. But the enterprise that this requires is basically shipbuilding, something that Maine knows a lot about. I already mentioned, yeah, the reducing price volatility. There have been a whole number of studies, and there's technical reasons about how this works in the energy markets. But basically, a lot of things that drive the cost of energy are the peaks, those moments of maximum demand during those really cold winter days, or sometimes really hot summer days. But offshore wind can help shave off those peaks, which really help to stabilize prices and put downward pressure on the overall market prices that we're all going to be paying for energy, especially over time as this matures. So this resource and this opportunity are not a secret. Offshore wind has been under discussion in Maine for a long time. There's a lot of really groundbreaking work on floating offshore wind happening actually at the University of Maine, led by Dr. Habib Dagher. But it's also sort of part of this national effort to decarbonize and develop offshore wind. Any offshore wind that happens in the Gulf of Maine is going to happen far offshore in federal waters. And leasing of areas for offshore wind is administered by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It's part of the Department of Interior. And this is their schedule for new areas they're going to be opening up for offshore wind leases over the next several years. And they're scheduled to do a lease in the Gulf of Maine in late 2024, so by the end of next year. So with all of this in mind, NRCM, along with a bunch of other partners, decided that now was the moment to make sure that Maine's voice was heard in this federal offshore wind development process by developing offshore wind legislation in the legislature this session. So a lot of this was built on the work of Maine's offshore wind roadmap. That was a multi-year process that brought together, in a similar way to the Climate Council, brought together stakeholders from all different aspects of this, from the environmental community concerned about ecosystems and wildlife, from the fishing community, around onshore infrastructure, port development, the supply chain, energy markets, all of these different things. And one of their recommendations was to pass procurement legislation, basically the way that Maine will purchase offshore wind power from some of these developments. But really, the objectives of this were, as I mentioned, to shape the development in federal waters of these offshore wind projects. Through those purchasing contracts, we can set standards for labor, for equity, for the environment, for fisheries, and how that all develops through these projects. And it really is our chance to realize the opportunity to create this new industry for Maine, using Maine-based technology, using Maine-based talent, and building on our maritime heritage as a state. So some of the key provisions in here, it sets a schedule of procurements. Basically, the Maine Public Utilities Commission will go out for bids, and the developers of offshore wind will bid in to give Maine the best deal on offshore wind power. The scope of this is 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040 to have that built, which is roughly equal to about half of Maine's electricity demand in 2040, including that growth in demand from things like heat pumps and electrifying heating, and from electric vehicles and things like that. Big emphasis on regional collaboration. There are other states who are also interested in floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, and we could really help with some of the costs of the development if we're working together with some of those other states. We have some provisions in there to facilitate developing a custom offshore wind port in Maine, which is going to be really critical for actually building and deploying this. If we don't have a place to build these turbines, they are not going to get built, and all that jobs and economic development will go elsewhere. But the thing that we're most proud of is the provisions we have in here to make sure that this isn't just offshore wind development at any cost, but it actually reflects the values that the Maine people have. Things like dedicated funding for environmental, wildlife, and fisheries research and mitigation, good job standards for wages and benefits, and siting incentives. We work closely with some fishing groups to incentivize siting these projects outside of the key lobstering grounds in Maine. And that was really important to us to make sure that we're going to be developing this in a way that reduces those conflicts as much as possible. So what's next? The federal process to come to that lease sale that I mentioned at the end of next year is continuing. They're narrowing down the best areas in the Gulf of Maine, the ones that have the least amount of conflict and the most resource to be able to offer a lease sale next year. We're continuing our efforts around port development. Like I said, it's going to be a really important piece. The timing of this is the sort of the full document that's going to detail all of those requirements that we talked about for things like equity, environment, fisheries. It's going to be developed in 2025 after the lease sale, and then that first round of procurements is going to be in 2026. All these projects also have to go through a lengthy federal permitting process about their construction plan, their operations plan. There's a lot of red tape, which is both good and bad. It makes things take longer, but also makes sure that we can really require these developers to cross all their T's and dot their I's on sort of how they're going to operate, build, decommission, all of the different aspects of this project. So we will definitely be fully engaged in that as those go on. And so this is really a long-term commitment for our organization to make sure that we both build these, but also do it at the high standards that Maine expects as we deploy this resource and take advantage of it for all the benefits that it could bring to Maine, both from the climate perspective, but also from an economic perspective as well.